since I've been asked to avoid illustrating my discourse with examples from my own work, this talk becomes an opportunity to articulate some thoughts about the interdependence of contemporary art production and curating. I should immediately say that I understand curating as a practice of mediation, but one that leaves room for, indeed demands, creative ambition and critical thinking. We all know that works of contemporary art often have no meaningful existence outside the situations where they meet their audiences. Increasingly, works of art do not get produced unless judged by someone else than their legally designated author to be ready for the moment of encounter. Exhibition budgets and curatorial working hours are routinely spent on making that moment happen. Both artists and curators dedicate a large portion of their time to project management, so there is already some de facto convergence between their professional identities. But is it only a gain if the division of labor between creators and mediators becomes even less clear? Should we accept that these job descriptions are becoming just two aspects of one continuum? Or should we continue to insist on inserting a versus between art making and exhibition making? It must be noted that the artist as curator remains a more socially acceptable character than the curator as artist. Witness the triumph of Jan Vo as the curatorial auteur of Slip of the Tongue, the counter biennale at the fashion mogul François Pinault's Punta della Dogana in Venice this summer. An exhibition that includes a considerable number of his own work. It is as if there were no conflict of interest here at all. Witness also the sustained popularity of artists' lecture performances as a mildly entertaining form of contemporary art production. If the lecturer can be characterized as an artist or self-identifies as one, the lecture qualifies as a work of art and will be judged or even collected as such. Hito Steyr and Payam Sharifi are among the leading ladies of the genre. Curators, on the other hand, must think twice before venturing too far into the territory of creative ambition. This might pay off as a highly specialized niche operation that it takes years to establish and secure. But usually, if curators want to inhabit the intermediary zone between production and mediation, where they might inspire artists rather than just facilitating their work, they should not appear to be too creative in their public discourse and demeanor. The curator cannot escape public scrutiny. If he works for institutions such as museums, his loyalties will be debated, not least by the media. Should he be serving the interests of the general public as the ultimate stakeholder, of the institution as agenda setter, or of the artist as content provider? I am, of course, using this management speak on purpose. Such utilitarian expectations towards institutional curating are often left unspoken, at least in the process leading up to a finished project, but they are nonetheless real. On the other hand, if the curator finds himself on the sliding scale between independent and unemployed, should he then promote his own employability by being more politically flexible than those on the inside? Or should he do his politics differently, setting an example as a defender of the freedom and specificity of art or its relevance as an articulation of society? Both strategies may be successful. Both carry risks. Obviously, curators of all categories try to strike the right balance between all these requirements, which should not be seen as categorical opposites, but rather as negotiable in the double sense of debatable and traversable, nuances of professionalism. how can curators productively exploit the tension between different forms of interiority and exteriority in relation to the art world and to society at large? The subversive is only possible from the inside. The political needs an outside not to suffocate. For any curator, much depends on the social skills he must have. It would be naive in the maturing version of the information society we live in to associate these skills only with the extroverted activities once known as networking, but now almost completely subsumed under socializing. The successful curator must handle a social network largely determined by the symptoms of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But he must also know how to empathize with those inhabiting the autistic spectrum when necessary. For instance, in intimate conversations with artists who have long claimed that particular idiosyncrasy for themselves. In my perception, it is my perception that institutional employers, at least some of them, are becoming ever more sensitive to the immaterial value that their curators' relations with artists represents. I also sense that artists increasingly judge curators by their capacity to understand and actively participate in creative processes. But is this only positive? Couldn't it also mean that curators are becoming the new censors? This more drastic name for the gatekeeper was once suggested to me by the senior Romanian artist John Grigorescu. He was comparing the experience of making and exhibiting work under socialism as it existed in Romania in the 1970s and 80s, and under the so-called curatorship that rules today's art world. Or are curators becoming a bit like the professional muses of the fashion industry? People paid to be inspiring, empathizing, and representative. Let's not forget that fashion is a branch of contemporary capitalism that is causing particular harm to the natural and social environment, precisely because of its ruthless production methods. The House of Dior reputedly pays Jennifer Lawrence 15 million euros, spread over 3 years, for these and other pictures. Curating, like many other kinds of cultural production today, is mostly about arranging and rearranging things that already exist. Yet, no one forces the curator to get involved in what Canadian pop philosophers now call curationism, the name for a rather desperate attempt to escape the sameness that characterizes contemporary social media reality through rarefied self-presentation, which is just as characteristic of it. To counter this, I believe that the curator can still exist as an almost independent public intellectual, as long as he cultivates a hands-on approach to the material and social aspects of his hybrid craft, and most importantly, as long as he actually believes in his own declaration that he works with, for, and through other people, and that his practice is ultimately about thinking together with them. Those other people are artists, but also audiences. The curator is wise to project himself as both creative and interpretative, both insider and outsider, someone who bridges internal and external worlds. He's wise to style himself as the middleman. In a society that believes in communication as a common but also marketable good, this role is easier to justify socially than that of a propagandist or connoisseur, the friend or lover of art. But tactical wisdom doesn't always make strategic sense. What is really at stake today is how the curator understands and enacts intellectual freedom, how he uses his status as a public intellectual to make coherent and relevant statements, and crucially, how he does this without disabling or negating what is specific about art, and more specifically, visual art. Politics does come into play here, as a symbolic game of flaunting political conviction that the art world loves to play, but also as the real politics of personal and systemic relations between people that no institution can do without. And of course, curating is institutional, no matter how independent the individual curator is. By the way, it is perfectly possible to be more independent inside a public institution than out there on the project market. Interiority and exteriority are only relations between images. But my point is that critical thinking is even more central to curating, and especially to its intimate relation with art production, than political conviction, social skills, or a passion for information and knowledge, although all these in themselves are good and necessary things. That, in fact, is the gist of the critique of Jan Wo's curatorial triumph in Venice that my friend and former colleague Claire Bishop published in the September issue of Art Forum. That the artist as curator in this case offers a softer mode of putting together a large collective exhibition, one where different voices are heard, but where they're not singing from the same sheet. Bishop questions the art world's current infatuation with this way of doing things, which in fact is not so dissimilar to the 19th century's cult of the fascinating but unaccountable genius. She also reminds her readers of the need for critical thinking and, of course, since she is an art historian, of the merit of rigorous art historical research. It is instructive to compare two of the biennales currently on show in Europe. The one in Venice, curated by Okwi Envezor, and the one in Istanbul, curated by Caroline Christoph Bakargiev. Inevitably, both exhibitions have flaws, but they also offer convincing moments of conviction. Unfortunately, both rely on commercial galleries to finance the production of new works. Ultimately, both are embedded in the leisure and tourism industries. They are, after all, taking place in Venice and Istanbul. Envezor may be credited with making the art world a bigger place by including many non-Western artists in his Documenta 11 in 2002, and Christoph Bakargiev may be credited with realigning art to non-linear thinking by eschewing a curatorial master narrative in a Documenta 13 in 2012. While Envezor may be criticized for being too coherent, not because all the works in Venice speak of the same thing, but because he largely relies on a stable of artists that includes too few new additions since 2002, Christoph Bakargiev may be faulted with the opposite transgression, because her biennial titled Saltwater conspicuously lacks flavor as a statement about the world that produced it. This is the most iconic piece, I suppose, in Christoph Bakargiev's Istanbul Biennial, and we could talk about it a bit later. I think it's quite interesting. It's the Argentinian sculptor Adrián Villarrojas, and the title is The Most Beautiful of All Mothers, 2015. And here I noted what it is. From my point of view, Envezor's approach is the more relevant one, not because he selects artists and works that back up what he himself wants to say, but because he makes sure that what his various audiences see connects to the world outside the exhibition. Of course, this also includes the inner world inhabited by artists. And this connection, in the end, is something the curator must be able to make, whether he self-identifies as a project manager, a new censor, a professional muse, or a public intellectual. Critical thinking does not always answer the call of reason or of moral imperative. It relates to, but is not defined or limited by, what is correct or just or free of self-contradiction. Critical thinking can also be visual, spatial, poetic. And of course you hear the quotation marks hanging around these words. It can be both free and right. Another way of putting it is that there is truth also in art. This is where the curator's understanding of the logic and reality of art production becomes crucial. In art, the logic of production is also that of visualization, of visual critical thinking. So when the curator and the artists think together, which is not the same thing as thinking the same thoughts at the same time in the same way, they may overcome the dogmatic streak of art together. They may join forces to resist the instrumentalization of art for various well-intended purposes, which is a sad reduction of its full potential. Outstanding artists who are also outstanding thinkers therefore offer the best inspiration and edification for curators. I know I'm not supposed to be talking about my own work here, but I must mention that I have the privilege of putting together a Robert Filiou retrospective of MHKA for the autumn of 2016, titled The Secret of Permanent Creation. Curators don't have to be great intellectuals. In fact, more often than not, great curators are not. And vice versa, great intellectuals are only seldom great curators. Curating is too practical, too much about production and consumption and mediation and mediatization. To characterize curating, I sometimes borrow the two terms infra-intellectual and supra-intellectual, coined more than 100 years ago in the context of discussions about philosophy, science, and religion by the best-selling intellectual superstar of that time. Henri Bergson lived exactly as long in the 19th century as he did in the 20th. He is perhaps best known for his thinking about time, and particularly for his refusal to see time as just another form of space, but one that it's more difficult to measure. Instead, Bergson insisted on the irreducibility of time, of its character as duration, and he did so by investing how European philosophy had thought of matter and memory, and by critiquing and rereading crucial scientific concepts of the time, Darwin's evolution and Einstein's relativity. In his second major book, Matter and Memory, from 1896, Bergson articulated an understanding of perception as something always alloyed with memory. This understanding rests on a cunning refusal to specify the differences between image, object, and body in common sense terms. The body and brain are, for Bergson, nothing more and nothing less than images among other images. And since the part cannot possibly create or contain the whole, this trick is possible only in language. The world cannot possibly exist only inside the brain. Yet, what Bergson wanted was precisely to create a philosophy compatible with common sense, which tells us that the outside world doesn't cease to exist when we no longer perceive it, and that it probably also existed before us. Therefore, he asks us to interpret phenomena commonly considered to be objects or bodies as images, and to refrain from trying to determine whether these phenomena exist inside us or outside of us, since interiority and exteriority are only relations between images. This fluid approach to the image as a category of thought and the subject and object of action is conditioned by Bergson's highly visual use of language. Arguably, it was his critical visual thinking that made him a pop philosopher in the first place. I think we still have a lot to learn from Bergson's rigor and fluidity, and from his measured use of paradox that doesn't descend into the oxymoronic. For instance, the title of his third major book from 1908 was Creative Evolution. I think we have a lot to learn from Bergson when we want to speak about curating and its various intimate relations with art production as a vehicle for what we may call critical visual thinking. The critical thinking that curating should offer is not necessarily the same that academic research may produce. It is not necessarily the same as that produced by political activism or by fiction writing, or for that matter, even by an artist's articulation of reality. What it is what it may be, and why it makes sense to call it critical visual thinking, is something that I am continuously asking myself as I do my work as a curator and writer and editor. Thank you. This, by the way, is a piece by Jimmy Durham from 1998. It is called, I Promise Not to Make No More Self-Referential Art.